There are moments that arrive without warning, settling into your life like dust on furniture you forgot to clean. This was one of them. Wesley's head rested against my chest, his breathing steady and soft, while the television cast pale blue light across my living room walls. The documentary we'd started watching about ocean currents had become background noise an hour ago, forgotten the moment he'd shifted closer and asked if he could stay like this for a while. I couldn't move. Not because his weight pinned me to the couch, but because moving might break whatever fragile thing had formed between us in the darkness. My arm had gone numb where it curved around his shoulders, but I didn't adjust it. I barely allowed myself to breathe. The text had come at 11:30. "You up?" "Just feeling off." 3 words that pulled me from the edge of sleep and brought him to my door 20 minutes later, still wearing the same gray hoodie he'd had on for the past 3 days. He hadn't been drinking. There was no crisis, no emergency that needed solving. He'd simply looked at me with those tired eyes and said he'd been lonely lately, that being here made the noise in his head a little quieter. I'd made tea neither of us drank. We'd sat on opposite ends of the couch while David Attenborough's voice filled the space between us, describing the way currents moved across ocean floors, carrying warmth to places that had never known it. Wesley had been restless at first, shifting positions every few minutes, running his hands through his hair the way he did when he couldn't find the right words for something. Then he'd asked if it would be weird to lie down, just for a bit. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I nodded because speaking felt too dangerous, too likely to reveal the careful distance I'd been maintaining for months. Now he was here, solid and warm against me, and I was discovering that some kinds of closeness were more terrifying than loneliness. His hair smelled like rain and the lavender detergent he'd started using since his ex moved out. One of his hands rested near my ribs, fingers occasionally twitching in whatever dream he'd fallen into or was pretending to have. I stared at the ceiling and tried to memorize the weight of him, the way his breathing shifted my shirt with each exhale, the sound he made when he settled deeper into sleep. Because I knew this was temporary. Wesley would wake up in the morning and remember he was straight, remember the life he'd built before loneliness had driven him to my doorstep. He would thank me and leave, and we would both pretend this night had been nothing more than comfort between friends. The documentary droned on about deep ocean trenches, places where light had never reached, where strange creatures had learned to create their own illumination in the endless dark. I wondered if that's what we were doing. 2 people who'd stumbled into their own kind of darkness, generating just enough warmth to survive another day. Wesley shifted against me, murmuring something I couldn't catch, and my heart performed some complicated rhythm I'd never learned the name for. I wanted to stay like this forever. I wanted him to wake up and ask for more than I knew how to give. I wanted to stop wanting things that would only hurt us both. But mostly, I wanted to believe that when he'd said I made things feel less loud, he'd meant it the same way I would have. That somewhere beneath the friendship we'd carefully constructed, something else was trying to grow in the spaces we'd left unguarded. The thought terrified me more than the loneliness ever had. Because wanting something you can't have is manageable. Wanting something you might already be holding. That's the kind of hope that could destroy everything you've built to protect yourself. I closed my eyes and listened to Wesley breathe, and wondered if the most dangerous thing about loneliness wasn't the emptiness it created, but the way it made you grateful for any warmth at all, even when you knew it would leave you colder than before. I should probably start with how we met, though looking back now, it feels less like a beginning and more like the moment 2 separate stories decided to become one. 3 years ago, at a 4th of July barbecue thrown by mutual friends in a backyard that smelled like charcoal and citronella candles, Wesley had been standing near the drink table, arguing good-naturedly with someone about whether Portland was becoming too gentrified to be worth saving. I'd been drawn to the conversation not because I disagreed, but because he spoke with the kind of passion that made you want to listen, even when you weren't sure you cared about the topic. I was 31 then, working at the downtown library during the day and spending my evenings bent over watercolor paintings that never quite captured what I saw in my head. My apartment reflected this divided life. Half practical space for a person who organized books for a living, half artist studio cluttered with brushes and half-finished canvases that leaned against walls like unfinished thoughts. The neighborhood I'd chosen sat in that uncomfortable space between what Portland used to be and what it was becoming. Old houses with peeling paint stood next to sleek condos with floor-to-ceiling windows. Coffee shops that had served the same regulars for decades shared blocks with juice bars that charged $12 for vegetables. I'd moved there because I could afford it, but I'd stayed because something about the transition felt familiar. The way old things and new things existed side by side, neither quite willing to give up their claim to the space. Wesley had approached me at that barbecue after overhearing me mention a book I'd been reading. He was 27 then, though he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged in whatever room he'd entered. Software engineering suited him in a way that made sense. He liked solving problems, building things that worked, creating order from chaos. His mind moved quickly, jumping between ideas with the kind of agility that made conversations feel like discovery rather than small talk. We'd talked until the fireworks ended and people started gathering their things to leave. He'd asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, and I'd said yes without thinking about what that meant or what I wanted it to mean. 3 days later, we were sitting in a cafe on Hawthorne, talking about books and movies and the strange way Portland seemed to exist in its own pocket of time, separate from the rest of the world. The friendship that grew from that first coffee felt natural in a way that surprised me. I'd always been careful about letting people too close, maintaining the kind of polite distance that kept relationships manageable and disappointment at bay. But Wesley had a way of asking questions that made you want to answer them, of listening that made you feel heard rather than simply tolerated. We fell into patterns quickly. Weekend walks through the neighborhoods we were both still learning to navigate. Long conversations on park benches where we'd sit until the light changed and remind us that time was still moving. Book recommendations passed back and forth like secret messages. The kind of friendship that develops its own gravity, pulling you into regular contact without anyone having to work at maintaining it. Wesley had been in a relationship then, with a woman named Sarah who worked in marketing and ran half marathons on weekends. They'd been together for almost 4 years, living in a neat apartment across town that always smelled like the expensive candles she bought from boutiques I couldn't afford to walk into. I'd met her a handful of times at group gatherings, and she'd seemed nice enough, the kind of person who remembered details about your life and asked follow-up questions that showed she'd been listening. I'd never examined too closely why their relationship felt like something happening at a distance, why Wesley never talked about her the way people talk about the person they plan to build a life with. Maybe I'd recognized something familiar in the careful way he spoke about their future, the same tone I used when discussing plans I hoped wouldn't come to pass. When they broke up last winter, it happened quietly. No dramatic fights or betrayals. Just the slow recognition that they'd been moving in different directions for longer than either wanted to admit. Wesley had called me on a Tuesday evening in February, his voice steady but hollow, and asked if I wanted to meet him for a drink. We'd sat in a dim bar downtown while he explained that they'd been talking in circles for weeks, that Sarah had finally said what they'd both been thinking, that caring about someone wasn't the same as wanting the same life. He'd moved into a studio apartment closer to downtown, a space that felt temporary even after he'd unpacked his books and hung his few pieces of art on the walls. The loneliness that had always existed around the edges of his personality became more pronounced, though he rarely mentioned it directly. Instead, I noticed it in the way he started texting more often, asking if I wanted company for grocery shopping or if I'd seen whatever documentary had just appeared on Netflix. I became his person gradually, without either of us deciding it should happen. The one he called when his father had a heart attack in April, who drove him to the hospital and sat in uncomfortable chairs while doctors delivered news that was better than expected but still left him shaken. The one he brought soup to when I caught the flu that knocked me out for a week, who stayed to make sure I ate it even though I insisted I was fine. The one who started to matter in ways that felt both natural and dangerous. Because somewhere in those months of coffee dates and late-night conversations, of shared silence and easy laughter, I'd stopped thinking of Wesley as just a friend. The change had been so gradual I couldn't pinpoint when it happened, like watching paint dry or seasons change. Imperceptible until you looked up and realized everything had shifted. I'd fallen in love with him the way you fall asleep, slowly and then all at once, without meaning to and without knowing how to stop. And I'd never told anyone, least of all Wesley, because some kinds of truth feel too fragile to speak aloud, too likely to shatter the careful thing you've built around them. My apartment had become the place he came when the studio felt too small, when the noise of the city became too much, when he needed someone who understood that sometimes conversation wasn't necessary. We developed a routine of sorts, him texting when he needed company, me always saying yes, both of us pretending this was simply what good friends did for each other. The couch where he now slept against my chest had witnessed months of careful distance, of conversations that skirted around the edges of deeper feelings, of moments when our hands almost touched and didn't. It had become a kind of border between friendship and something else, a place where we could be close without having to name what that closeness meant. Now, feeling the weight of him breathing against me, I understood that all those months of careful friendship had been leading to this moment. Not because either of us had planned it, but because some kinds of intimacy develop their own momentum, drawing you forward until you find yourself holding exactly what you'd been afraid to want. The documentary continued its exploration of ocean currents, describing how water could travel thousands of miles carrying memory from one place to another, how temperature and salinity created invisible highways that connected distant parts of the world. I wondered if that's what friendship was, a current that carried pieces of one person into another, until you couldn't tell where the boundary was supposed to be. Wesley shifted against me, his hand moving slightly against my ribs, and I realized I was no longer thinking about friendship at all. I was thinking about the way love sometimes arrives disguised as something safer, something more acceptable, until the night when disguises stop working and you're left holding the truth of what you've been feeling all along. The truth that I loved him, had loved him for months, and that tonight, for the first time, that love felt like something that might not destroy us both. The text arrived on a Tuesday evening while rain drummed against my windows with the persistence of someone who wouldn't be ignored. Mind if I come over? I don't want to be alone tonight. 7 words that landed in my phone like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples I couldn't see but somehow felt spreading outward through the careful equilibrium of our friendship. I'd been mixing watercolors at my kitchen table, trying to capture the particular gray-green of Portland sky just before a storm breaks, when the notification lit up my screen. The paint on my brush had started to dry while I stared at the message, reading it twice before my brain caught up with what Wesley was actually asking. Not for coffee, not for dinner, not for one of our usual activities that came with built-in end times and natural exits. He was asking for company in its purest form, the kind that acknowledged loneliness as a condition rather than a temporary mood. I typed back yes before I could think too hard about what that meant. I always said yes to Wesley, had been saying yes for 3 years now, but this felt different somehow. More urgent, more necessary. 20 minutes later, he was standing in my doorway looking like the rain had followed him inside. His hair was damp and unruly, his jacket zipped up to his chin in a way that made him seem smaller than usual. He'd been wearing the same gray hoodie under the jacket for days now. I'd started to recognize it as his comfort uniform, the thing he reached for when the world felt too complicated to dress for properly. I made tea because it seemed like what the evening required, something warm and purposeful that would give our hands something to do while we figured out why he needed to be here. We settled on the couch with our mugs, the documentary about ocean currents picking up where we'd left it the week before. David Attenborough's voice filled the space between us, describing how deep water could carry stories across thousands of miles, how currents invisible from the surface shaped everything about the world above. But Wesley wasn't watching. His energy felt restless, unfocused, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. He kept shifting positions, running his hands through his still damp hair, touching his mug without actually drinking from it. The tea grew lukewarm while he stared at nothing, his eyes focused on some middle distance that existed only in his own head. "I've just been thinking a lot lately," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been holding thoughts too heavy for one person to carry alone. About what matters. About people who make things feel less heavy. The words hung in the air between us like fog, substantial enough to feel, but too delicate to touch directly. I wanted to ask what had happened that day, what had driven him through the rain to my apartment, what thoughts had been circling in his head with enough persistence to make solitude unbearable. But something in his posture warned me away from questions, suggested that naming whatever was bothering him might make it more real than he was ready to handle. So I waited. I'd learned over the years that Wesley processed feelings the way he approached coding problems, methodically, turning them over until he found the right angle, the approach that would unlock whatever he was trying to understand. Pushing never helped. Patience usually did. We sat through another segment of the documentary, watching footage of creatures that lived so deep in the ocean they'd evolved their own methods of creating light, generating bioluminescence to navigate darkness that had existed since the world began. There was something both beautiful and devastating about their isolation, the way they'd adapted to conditions that would crush anything from the surface world. When Wesley finally spoke again, it was while we were carrying our barely touched mugs to the kitchen, moving through the domestic ritual of cleaning up even though neither of us was ready for the evening to end. He stopped at the sink, his hands wrapped around his mug like he was trying to absorb whatever warmth remained, and turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Can I just lie here for a while? On you?" The question came out raw, unpolished, like he'd been practicing different ways to ask it and finally given up on finding words that didn't sound like what they were, a request for intimacy from someone who'd never asked for it before, at least not so directly. His voice carried the kind of vulnerability that made you want to handle it carefully, aware that the wrong response could send someone retreating so far into themselves you might never reach them again. I set my own mug down and nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady enough for actual words. Of course, I managed finally, though the phrase felt inadequate for what he was asking, what I was agreeing to. We moved back to the couch like we were approaching something sacred, both of us suddenly aware that whatever happened next would change the geography of our friendship in ways we couldn't map in advance. Wesley sat down first, then looked up at me with a question in his eyes that I answered by settling beside him, creating space for whatever arrangement he needed. It took him a while to figure out how to position himself, how to translate the request he'd made into actual physical contact. He moved carefully, hesitantly, like someone learning a new language who wasn't sure they were pronouncing the words correctly. First sitting close enough that our shoulders touched, then gradually letting himself lean until his weight began to shift toward me. When he finally settled with his head against my chest, something fundamental shifted in the room. Not just the arrangement of our bodies, but the entire context of our relationship, the assumptions we'd been carrying about what was allowed between us. His hand came to rest near my ribs, fingers curled loosely against my shirt, and he went very still, as if he too was surprised by what he'd asked for and received. I could feel his breathing gradually slow as he relaxed into the contact, could feel the tension leaving his shoulders as he allowed himself to sink more fully into the refuge he'd created. My own heartbeat felt unnaturally loud, like something he couldn't help but notice, and I found myself trying to breathe quietly enough not to disturb whatever peace he was finding. The documentary continued in the background, but neither of us was watching anymore. We existed in our own pocket of time, suspended between the friendship we'd built so carefully and something else entirely, something that felt both inevitable and impossible. Then Wesley spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, the words vibrating against my chest where his head rested. "You're kind of my favorite person, you know that?" The statement landed with the weight of confession, heavy with meaning I wasn't sure I was allowed to interpret. It wasn't "I love you," but it wasn't exactly friendship either. It occupied some middle territory that felt both safer and more dangerous than either extreme, acknowledging something real while stopping short of naming it completely. I wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that he'd become essential to me in ways I'd never planned for, that the thought of him needing comfort he couldn't find anywhere else made my chest tight with feelings I'd been carefully not examining. But speaking felt too risky, too likely to shatter whatever delicate thing was forming between us. So I stayed silent, letting my hand find its way to his hair, fingers moving through the soft strands with a tenderness I'd never allowed myself before. He made a small sound, relief, maybe, or recognition, and pressed closer, his arm coming around my waist in a gesture that felt both possessive and protective. We stayed like that while the rain continued outside, and the television painted shifting light across the walls. Two people who'd spent 3 years learning how to be friends, discovering that some kinds of closeness couldn't be contained by friendship, that loneliness sometimes asked for remedies that formal relationships weren't designed to provide. I felt my heart breaking and soaring simultaneously, caught between gratitude for this unexpected intimacy and terror at what it might mean. Because Wesley wasn't just anyone asking to lie on my chest. He was the person I'd been carefully not falling in love with for months. The straight friend whose happiness I'd prioritized over my own feelings so consistently, I'd almost convinced myself those feelings didn't exist. Now, with his weight warm against me and his breathing sinking gradually to mine, I couldn't pretend anymore. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, it was changing us both. And I had no idea whether that change would bring us closer together or tear apart everything we'd built. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Wesley had asked for something he'd never asked for before, and I'd given it without hesitation. Tonight, he'd called me his favorite person with a voice that suggested the words carried more weight than their literal meaning. Tonight, he was choosing to be vulnerable with me in a way that felt like trust and hope and possibility all braided together. The Ocean documentary reached a segment about thermal vents, places where heat from the Earth's core created oases of life in the deepest, darkest parts of the sea. Entire ecosystems thriving around sources of warmth that existed nowhere else. Creatures finding ways to flourish in conditions that should have been impossible to survive. I thought about that as Wesley's breathing deepened toward sleep, his body heavy and trusting against mine. Maybe that's what we were discovering. How to create warmth in spaces that had been cold, how to build something sustainable around sources of heat we'd never acknowledged before. Maybe loneliness wasn't the absence of connection, but the presence of connection you weren't allowed to name. And maybe what Wesley had asked for tonight wasn't just comfort, but permission to stop pretending that the thing between us was smaller than it actually was. I closed my eyes and tried to memorize everything about this moment. The weight of him, the sound of rain on glass, the way the light from the television moved across his sleeping face. Because I knew that tomorrow would bring questions we weren't ready to answer, conversations we didn't know how to have. But tonight, I was his favorite person. Tonight, he'd chosen my chest as the place to rest his head when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years of careful friendship, we were allowing ourselves to need each other in ways that had nothing to do with what was safe or sensible or easy to explain. And that felt like the beginning of something that might save us both or destroy everything we'd worked so hard to protect. After that Tuesday night, something fundamental shifted in the architecture of our friendship, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. Wesley started appearing at my door more frequently, sometimes with groceries tucked under his arm and a suggestion that we cook dinner together, sometimes carrying a vinyl record he'd found at a shop downtown and thought I might like, sometimes with nothing at all except the quiet admission that his studio apartment felt too small for whatever he was feeling. The pattern established itself gradually, the way habits form when they serve a need you didn't know you had. Thursday evenings became an unspoken expectation. Weekend afternoons when the rain made outdoor plans impossible. Monday nights when the week ahead felt too daunting to face alone. He'd text asking if I was free, and I'd always say yes. Had been saying yes so consistently that we'd stopped pretending either of us expected any other answer. My apartment began to accommodate his presence in small, almost invisible ways. An extra coffee mug left clean on the counter. 2 plates set out before he arrived, as if I'd known he was coming even when he hadn't texted ahead. A section of my couch that retained the impression of his shoulders, the place where he'd started settling automatically whenever he walked through my door. We fell into domestic rhythms that felt both natural and charged with possibility. Wesley would arrive with ingredients for pasta, and we'd move around my small kitchen with the careful choreography of people learning to share space. His hand brushing my back when he reached around me for the olive oil, my fingers grazing his when he handed me vegetables to chop. These moments of contact felt electric and ordinary at the same time, like touching a live wire that had somehow become essential to your daily routine. The couch had transformed into something approaching sacred ground, a place where the usual rules of friendship seemed suspended. Wesley would settle with his head against my shoulder while we listened to the records he brought. Miles Davis, Joni Mitchell, artists whose music demanded the kind of attention that made conversation optional. His hand would rest on my knee, fingers occasionally tracing absent patterns against the fabric of my jeans, and I'd find myself holding my breath, afraid that moving might break whatever spell allowed this level of intimacy between us. Sometimes he'd fall asleep during these evening sessions, his breathing deepening until his full weight settled against me. I developed the ability to sit motionless for hours, my arm going numb beneath his shoulders while I studied the way sleep smoothed the worry lines from his forehead, the way his mouth relaxed into something approaching peace. In those moments, watching him trust me with his unconscious vulnerability, I felt both powerful and terrified, aware that I was being given something precious and fragile that could shatter if I handled it wrong. The physical contact between us had begun to accumulate its own momentum, a hand lingering on my shoulder when he arrived, his fingers playing with the hem of my shirt while we talked. The way he'd started reaching for me automatically when he laughed, his hand finding my arm or my leg as if touch had become his natural response to joy. Each gesture felt both innocent and loaded with meaning, like we were speaking a language neither of us had formally learned but somehow understood. I told myself it was healing, nothing more. Wesley was recovering from a relationship that had left him questioning fundamental things about himself, and I was simply providing the kind of comfort any good friend would offer. The fact that his ex-girlfriend had never touched him the way he touched me now, casually, constantly, like contact was necessary for basic function, was something I tried not to examine too closely. The fact that I'd never allowed anyone this level of access to my physical space was a detail I pushed to the edges of my consciousness, filing it away with all the other truths I wasn't ready to acknowledge. But Wesley had started saying things that made it harder to maintain the fiction that this was ordinary friendship. Quiet observations that arrived like gifts wrapped in careful casualness, as if he was testing whether I'd accept them or hand them back unopened. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he'd murmur against my shoulder during the documentaries we'd started watching purely as background for our wordless communication. "You always make me feel safe," he'd say when I'd brush my fingers through his hair, the gesture becoming so automatic I'd sometimes realize I was doing it without conscious decision. These statements hung in the air between us like questions neither of us was brave enough to answer directly. They felt too heavy for friendship, but not quite specific enough to be declarations. They existed in that dangerous territory where meaning depended entirely on interpretation, where the same words could be profound confession or casual gratitude depending on what you needed them to be. One night in early spring, when the windows were open for the first time in months and the apartment filled with the green smell of rain on new leaves, Wesley fell asleep with his head in my lap while I read a book about Arctic exploration. My hand had found its way into his hair without conscious thought, fingers moving through the soft strands with the kind of tenderness I'd never allowed myself with anyone before. He'd made a small sound, satisfaction, maybe, or recognition, and pressed closer, his arm wrapping around my waist in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. I'd continued reading. Though the words on the page had lost all meaning, my attention focused entirely on the weight of him against me and the way he responded to my touch. When my fingers traced along his temple, he'd sighed and leaned into the contact. When I brushed them down the back of his neck, he'd made that soft sound again, the one that suggested my touch was answering some need he'd been carrying without knowing how to ask for what he wanted. The line between friendship and something else had become so thin that night, I could barely see it anymore, like trying to track a horizon that kept shifting whenever you looked directly at it. But I didn't push beyond whatever boundary we were approaching. I couldn't risk the friendship we'd built, couldn't chance losing the Wesley I was allowed to have by asking for the Wesley I wasn't sure existed. Because that was the truth I'd been avoiding. I didn't know if the intimacy he was offering meant the same thing to him that it meant to me. His touches might be comfort-seeking rather than affection-giving. His need for physical closeness might have nothing to do with romantic feeling and everything to do with the specific kind of loneliness that followed the end of a long relationship. He might simply be learning to receive care from someone who offered it freely, without conditions or expectations. And I was willing to be that person, even if it meant wanting what I could never ask for. Even if it meant falling asleep most nights with the memory of his weight against me, and waking up most mornings with the knowledge that I was in love with someone who might never love me back the same way. Even if it meant building my life around the hope that someday the careful distance we maintained might collapse entirely, revealing whatever it was we'd been protecting by keeping it hidden. The transformation happening between us felt like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom. Shapes emerging slowly from what had seemed like blank paper, details becoming clearer as you waited for chemistry to do its work. But unlike photographs, this process had no guaranteed outcome. We might be developing something beautiful, or we might discover that what we'd thought was forming had been an illusion all along. A trick of light and shadow that disappeared the moment you tried to examine it directly. Wesley had started bringing records by artists I'd never heard of, musicians who sang about desire in languages that made longing sound like prayer. We'd listen in the lamplight while rain painted patterns on the windows, his head heavy against my chest, my fingers moving through his hair with increasing boldness as weeks passed, and he continued to not only allow but encourage these small intimacies. The music created a soundtrack for whatever was growing between us, melodies that seemed designed for the exact emotional territory we were navigating. Songs about wanting what you couldn't name, about love that existed in the spaces between words, about the particular ache of caring for someone whose feelings remained beautifully, terrifyingly uncertain. During those evenings, I'd find myself studying Wesley's face in the low light, memorizing the way peace settled across his features when he felt safe enough to stop performing normalcy. The way his breathing would sync with mine when he was truly relaxed. The way his hand would tighten around my shirt when he was shifting toward sleep, as if he was afraid I might disappear while he wasn't paying attention. These observations accumulated like evidence in a case I was building, but not yet ready to present. Evidence that what was happening between us had moved far beyond the boundaries of conventional friendship. Evidence that the careful distance we maintained during our daily lives collapsed completely in the intimate darkness of my living room. Evidence that Wesley needed something from me that he'd never needed from anyone else, and that I was willing to provide it regardless of what it cost me emotionally. But evidence wasn't certainty. And certainty was what I needed before I could risk everything we'd built on the possibility that his need might be transforming into want, that his comfort might be becoming desire, that the person I'd fallen in love with might be falling in love with me in return. So I waited, and watched, and let my hands learn the geography of his hair, his shoulders, his back, while he taught me what it meant to be someone's refuge, someone's favorite person, someone's answer to the kind of loneliness that could only be cured by a very specific kind of closeness. The spring progressed around us while we created our own season inside my apartment, one measured not by changing weather, but by the gradual erosion of whatever barriers had kept us in the safe territory of friendship. Each evening together felt like practice for something larger, something that would require more courage than either of us had demonstrated yet. But for now, it was enough to exist in this liminal space, this place between what we were and what we might become. It was enough to let Wesley fall asleep against me while records spun their stories of love and loss. Enough to wake up each day knowing that by evening, he'd likely be back, carrying some small excuse for contact, but really just needing what we'd learned to give each other without having to name it. It was enough, even though it wasn't everything. even though every touch made me want more. Even though I was discovering that the most exquisite torture wasn't wanting someone you couldn't have, but having someone in ways that made you hope for everything while guaranteeing you nothing. The body remembers what the heart refuses to admit, and both of our bodies were developing their own language, their own logic, their own understanding of what was possible between us. All I had to do was trust that eventually, our hearts would catch up to what our hands already knew. The storm that night felt like something the city had been holding its breath for, rain striking my windows with intensity that made you grateful to be inside. Wesley had arrived with wine and restless energy, and somehow we'd ended up on the floor with our backs against the couch, the empty bottle between us like evidence of conversations that had wandered into territory we'd never explored. I don't remember how Julian's name came up. We'd been talking about places that hold memories, how you could walk through a neighborhood years later and still feel the ghost of who you used to be. Maybe it was the wine, or the storm, or the particular quality of late-night honesty. But suddenly I was telling Wesley about a man I'd loved 3 years before we met. Julian had been a photographer who saw beauty in overlooked things. We'd met at a gallery opening, spent 6 months building something that felt like it might last. Until it didn't. Until the careful distance Julian maintained around commitment became too painful, and I'd been forced to choose between accepting scraps of affection or walking away. Wesley listened with the attention he gave problems he was trying to solve, asking gentle questions that revealed he was hearing not just the story but the spaces around it. Did it hurt? Yes. Do you still think about him? Not the way I used to. The conversation settled deeper after that. Wine and storm and late hour creating intimacy where usual boundaries seemed suspended. Wesley talked about his relationship with Sarah in ways he'd never allowed before, admitting he'd known for months something essential was missing. Then Wesley went quiet, staring at the rain-dark window before turning to look at me with an expression I couldn't read. "What would you do," he asked slowly, "if someone you cared about didn't know how to name what they were feeling?" The question landed between us like something fragile and significant. His eyes held vulnerability I'd seen only when he was falling asleep against me, when his defenses were too tired to maintain their posts. "I'd wait," I said finally. "If it meant something, I'd wait." Wesley nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed something he'd been hoping to hear. The storm continued while we sat in charged silence, both aware we'd moved into territory that couldn't be unmapped. When he spoke again, his voice carried careful courage that comes from standing at the edge of something terrifying and necessary. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air like the last note of a song, beautiful, incomplete, and impossible to take back. Wesley was looking at me with hope and terror in equal measure, waiting for an answer that would either open everything between us or close it forever. "Yes," I managed finally, the word emerging like something I'd been holding my breath to say for months. Wesley moved toward me with the same careful deliberation he'd shown that first night, as if rushing would shatter whatever delicate thing was forming. His hand found the side of my face, fingers tracing my jaw like he was memorizing details he'd never allowed himself to notice. When his lips finally met mine, the kiss was soft and tentative and full of questions, like he was learning a new language. His mouth tasted like wine and possibility, and when I kissed him back, when I let my hand find the back of his neck, he made a small sound that suggested this moment was answering some need he'd been carrying without knowing how to name it. We broke apart after what felt like forever and not nearly long enough, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air. Wesley's eyes were wide and dark, filled with wonder and relief. "That was," he said softly, "exactly what I thought it would be like." The admission carried the weight of revelation. He'd been thinking about kissing me, wanting it enough to finally ask despite every risk. The careful distance we'd maintained had been protection against this moment, this crossing into territory where there would be no pretending anymore. I could taste storm and wine and salt of tears I hadn't realized were falling. This was the moment everything changed, the moment we stopped being friends who touched carefully and became something else entirely. Finally, Wesley pulled back to look at me directly, his hand covering mine where it rested against his chest. "I don't know what this makes us," he said quietly. "I just know I've been wanting to do that for longer than I've been willing to admit." "We don't have to know yet," I told him. "We just have to be honest about what we want." "And what do you want?" he asked. "You," I said simply. "I want you." Wesley smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen all evening, and leaned forward to kiss me again, this time with less hesitation and more certainty, like he was beginning to believe that what we were discovering was real, was mutual, was worth whatever complications it might bring. Outside, the storm continued washing the city clean. Inside, Wesley and I were conducting our own kind of storm, dismantling careful structures we'd built to protect ourselves and discovering what might be possible in the space that remained. The morning after the kiss arrived with harsh clarity that made me question whether the previous night had been real. Sunlight streamed through my windows, illuminating evidence of our evening. 2 wine glasses, cushions on the floor, the lingering scent of possibility hanging in the air like smoke. Wesley had stayed until dawn, but as morning light crept across the floor, something shifted in his posture. He'd made excuses about needing to get home, kissed me goodbye with hesitation that felt nothing like the intentional intimacy we'd shared hours earlier. When he came over 3 days later, the change was immediate. He joked too much, filled every silence with commentary about anything that didn't require acknowledging what had happened. His eyes kept sliding away from mine, as if direct contact might force conversations he wasn't ready to have. But he did keep coming over. The physical intimacy evolved into something more charged but tentative, like we were both aware every touch now carried weight it hadn't before. He'd still let me brush my fingers through his hair, but now he'd catch my wrist sometimes, holding my hand against his scalp like he was afraid I might stop. 2 weeks after the kiss, I'd had enough. Wesley was standing in my doorway making elaborate excuses about why he could only stay an hour, something about meetings that sounded rehearsed. I watched him arrange his face into casual friendliness, preparing to spend another evening pretending what existed between us was simple. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't mean something," I said. Wesley went still, his expression cycling through surprise, fear, and what might have been relief. "What do you want me to say?" he asked finally. "I want you to tell me what you want this to be." Wesley ran his hands through his hair. "I don't know what I am, Emery. I'm not. I never thought about guys before. I don't want to mess this up." "Then don't," I said. "Just tell me what you want." Wesley looked at me across the space that felt simultaneously too small and impossibly vast. "I want you. I just don't know how to explain it yet." "That's okay," I told him, stepping closer. "You don't have to explain it, but you do have to be honest." Wesley stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against him with fierceness that suggested he'd been holding himself back for weeks. His head found its familiar place against my chest. "This is the only thing that's felt right in a long time," he murmured. I felt my resistance crumble, the careful protection around my heart giving way to possibility that what I'd been wanting might actually be mutual. Wesley lifted his head to look at me, his face holding vulnerability and determination. "I don't know what this makes us," he said quietly. "I don't know what to call it or how to explain it. But I know I don't want to keep pretending it isn't happening. We don't have to have answers yet," I told him. "We just have to be willing to figure it out together." Wesley leaned forward to kiss me with intentionality that had been missing from our careful interactions. This wasn't wine-softened experimentation. This was choice made in daylight, with clear eyes and the understanding that some decisions changed everything. "I've been so scared," he admitted when we broke apart. "Scared of what wanting you might mean about who I am. Scared of ruining the best friendship I've ever had." "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. "However long it takes, whatever it looks like, I'm not going anywhere." Wesley smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen since that first night we'd crossed the line. We settled on the couch together, the familiar arrangement transformed by honesty rather than shadowed by avoidance. "I want to try this," he said quietly. "Whatever this is, however it works, I want to try. I can't promise I'll have all the answers right away. Can't promise I won't get scared sometimes. But I want to try." We sealed the agreement with a kiss that carried the weight of choice rather than urgency of confession. Wesley settled back against my chest with a sigh that sounded like someone finally allowing themselves to exhale after holding their breath for months. The choice had been made. The door had been opened. Whatever came next would require new kinds of courage, but for tonight, it was enough to hold each other in the aftermath of honesty, finally willing to find out what might be possible when careful distance collapsed into intentional closeness. Time has a different quality when you stop fighting what you want. The months that followed passed with gentle progression that made me understand why some people talk about love as a season rather than a moment, something that arrives gradually and settles into stay. We never figured out what to call ourselves. The question would surface occasionally when friends inquired with careful curiosity, but the absence of labels felt like freedom. We were permission to be exactly what we were, without compressing our reality into words that belonged to other people's stories. Wesley's coffee mug found a permanent place in my dish drainer. His books appeared on my shelves. A spare key materialized on his keyring without ceremony. The practical intimacy that develops when two people stop measuring every gesture for implications. Mornings became sacred. Wesley would arrive early, letting himself in with quiet efficiency, making coffee with focused attention. He'd learned exactly how I liked it, took genuine pleasure in getting the proportions right. We'd sit at my small table, sharing newspaper sections and comfortable silence. Ordinary mornings threaded through with contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong. The touch between us evolved into something natural and unself-conscious. His hand would find mine across the breakfast table without decision. He'd brush fingers through my hair while I painted, so automatic I'd sometimes realize he was doing it only when he stopped. We developed our own language of small intimacies that carried weight of choice without requiring verbal acknowledgement. Wesley's transformation was subtle but profound, like watching someone slowly relax muscles they'd held tense for years. He stopped monitoring his reactions, stopped treating his feelings for me like symptoms requiring management. The man who'd once been terrified that wanting me might change his understanding of himself had learned to trust that love could expand rather than threaten identity. Fall settled over Portland with dramatic flair. Wesley and I took long walks through neighborhoods learning to balance preservation with progress, talking about books and small observations that felt significant simply because we were sharing them. He'd started bringing records again, but now the music served different purpose, marking transition from day into evening, from outside world into private space we'd created together. One evening in late October, after a gray day that stayed gray, Wesley arrived carrying groceries and wearing the soft expression that meant work had been draining. We cooked together in comfortable quiet, radio playing softly while we created something nourishing. His shoulder bumped mine when he reached around me, pausing to press a kiss to my temple with such automatic tenderness I might have missed it. After dinner, we settled on the couch with wine and Miles Davis. Wesley shifted until he was lying with his head on my chest, position we perfected over months of practice. My hand found its way into his hair automatically, fingers moving through soft strands with muscle memory that develops when you've been allowed to touch someone exactly how you want. The record played through its first side while Wesley's hand rested against my ribs, occasionally tracing small patterns. This had become our greatest skill, ability to be together without performing togetherness, to exist in each other's company with ease that felt both miraculous and inevitable. The rain continued outside while we existed in warm light and accumulated affection. I thought about all the evenings spent exactly like this, all the quiet moments that had built into something resembling a life together. Not dramatic romance, but something more sustainable, companionship that had deepened into love so gradually neither of us could identify when friendship had transformed into something essential. Wesley had stopped questioning what we were months ago, stopped worrying about labels or explanations. The man who'd once been terrified had learned to trust that some feelings were larger than identity, that love could expand your sense of who you were rather than threatening it. I pressed a kiss to the top of his head, another automatic gesture, and felt him settle more deeply with satisfaction and gratitude. This was what we'd built, not passion that burned bright and fast, but warmth that sustained, comfort that endured, peace strong enough to weather whatever complications the world might offer. Then Wesley spoke, voice soft against my chest, emerging from peaceful quiet like something he'd been saving to say. Still lonely? The question was gentle, carrying curiosity rather than concern, weighted with memory of where we'd both been when this started. Wesley lifted his head to look at me, hair messed from my fingers, eyes holding direct warmth that had taken months to develop. Not with you, he said simply. He settled back against my chest with a sigh that sounded like someone finally allowing themselves to exhale. The sound carried relief and recognition, acknowledgement that what we'd built was exactly what both of us had needed, even when we hadn't known how to ask for it. The rain continued while we held each other in lamplight. Two people who discovered that the opposite of loneliness wasn't necessarily romance or passion, but presence, comfort, the ability to rest in someone else's company without having to earn that rest. Wesley's breathing gradually deepened toward sleep, his body growing heavy and trusting. I continued stroking his hair, the gesture as natural as breathing, as essential as heartbeat. This was how healing happened, not in dramatic gestures, but in accumulation of small comforts, gradual building of trust, patient construction of safety. The lamp painted everything warm and golden while I understood that we'd found something worth protecting. We'd built refuge from loneliness, a place where need was welcomed rather than feared, where touch was offered freely and received with gratitude. The heart never needed a name for what it already understood. What our hearts understood was that love could arrive disguised as friendship and reveal itself gradually, that healing could happen in spaces between words, that the opposite of loneliness was simple, sustained presence, the ability to rest in someone else's company and know that rest would be protected. Wesley slept peacefully against me while night settled around us, and I knew we'd found something extraordinary in the accumulation of ordinary moments. Two people who'd stopped fighting the current carrying them toward each other, finally willing to float together toward whatever shore love might choose. The rain continued its gentle work, washing the world clean while we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.